evening, and welcome to the fifth episode of the month of Digital Climate Action with Bring Back Green Foundation, Greenpeace India, and Fridays for Future India. And today we'll be discussing all about climate breakdown and gender rights. So I think it is quite cool to assume that long gone are the days when we could refer to changing tides as just climate change. Because just look around us. In the last year, 2019, all around the world, forest fires, cities suffocated, polar ice caps were melting, huge areas submerged underwater, thousands of living beings perished, all because of climate change. Yes, it's no longer just climate change. We are headed towards a climate breakdown. Climate breakdown is a term that is increasingly being used to replace climate change. And this is a very conscious effort by scientists and environmental rights defenders to drive home the reality of what is happening around us in terms of nature and in terms of the planet. So just to maybe give you a quick reminder, the years 2015 to 2019, those 5 years were the warmest on record. And the decade 2010 to 2019 was the warmest recorded decade ever since the 19th century. It is also interesting to note that ever since 1980, every other decade was warmer or hotter than the preceding decade, stretching back from the 1850. And the trend continues in 2020. We all heard reports about how this January was the warmest globally, and even in the northern hemisphere, parts of Europe, they actually did go through a very unusually weird warm winter and summer. So probably I shouldn't dwell more on these alarming statistics, because I think this gives you a general idea of how grim the situation is, and to imagine that the situation is even more grim for the most disadvantaged amongst us. That will be the crux of our topic today, and that is where gender rights come in terms of climate breakdown. So it has been proved that with accelerated climate change, or with climate breakdown as we call it, the instances of gender-based violence and the instances of gender inequalities also rise in the society. A most recent study by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, in this study, it took 2 years to complete. It was the largest study on this topic of environmental degradation and gender rights, and they went through almost 1,000 research sources, and it came to the conclusion that along with an increasing climate deterioration, there is also an increase in gender-based violence. There are reports that suggest that sex trafficking and the instances of gender-based violence amongst environmental migrants or climate refugees are very huge. And it's not just pertaining to these communities. See, gender-based violence is actually it's very broad. It takes many forms. There is domestic violence, there is sexual harassment and rape, there is forced sex work, forced marriage, child marriage, and many other forms of women exploitation. And it has been proven that when a natural crisis happens or environmental disasters happen, sex trafficking rates also goes up along with it in most communities. You see, in most of the communities, in most of the disadvantaged communities, the women and gender minorities are at a greater rate of disadvantage. They are more vulnerable because, see, most of them do not have land rights, they do not have legal rights, they do not have stable housing, and all of these put them at very exposed positions. So when climate change or natural crisis comes along with all the other issues that they have, they become targeted first. For instance, in communities, mostly in Asia and in African communities, the young girls, they are more than often married off at very early age by families that are facing the consequences of climate change. You will not believe me, but around the world, 12 million more girls, they were forced to get married at a very early stage by families that were going through natural disasters or that were going through climate change effects. There was also a hike of around 20 to 30% in sex trafficking in communities that went through natural disasters or environmental disasters. And all of these actually show a very dangerous trend. We already discussed on the first day about how women and gender minorities, or women and young girls, they are still having a huge share of the workload. It is not being equally shared between genders, and so the duty of getting firewood or of getting natural resources, food, water, everything falls on them. And with climate change, they are exposed to even further distances, which means even further risk to their health as well as safety. And when it comes to gender minorities and women, the access to sexual and reproductive health is very important because of a lot of cultural taboos in our society, making it more riskier for them to engage in sexual activities or reproductive activities. And because of climate change, what will happen is the access to sexual and reproductive rights of gender minorities and women, it takes a lower priority. Existence comes first than these things, and that means more of them will be prone to health hazards, more of them will die from at times of natural calamities. And like we discussed yesterday, all these relief camps and labor camps that come up, or even these camps for climate refugees, they are not very safe for gender minorities and women. They are actually put under a lot of threat because of their sex, because of their gender. And this brings to point another very startling or interesting case scenario, and that is how around the world young women and young gender minorities who stand up for the environment, who stand up for their community, are targeted by big corporate. They are targeted by the most powerful men in their communities, and they are targeted by their sex. Rape threats were issued, and a lot of them do get raped, and it is seen as setting an example for others who might want to stand up for the community. And this is a dangerous trend. This is something that should shake us all up so that we sit up and start having these conversations. I think this should give you a general idea of how intertwined gender rights and climate breakdown is. And that is why all over the world people have been pressurizing UN and other global heads and policymakers to really see how tackling gender rights is the first step towards having a holistic approach to climate change as well. And I think so this is a very good topic to wrap up these webinar series that we have had in these last 5 days, and I really believe that it has been helpful to you to understand the interconnections between gender and climate change. So maybe until we meet next time, bye bye.